Just 7 days after burying the love of my life, I sat across from my stepson at our kitchen table when he looked me dead in the eye and said, "Pack your bags, Myrtle. This house isn't yours anymore." His wife smirked beside him, already measuring the windows for new curtains. They thought I was just a grieving widow with nowhere to turn, but what they didn't know was that my husband had been preparing for this moment for years, leaving me weapons they never saw coming. If you want to see how this story of betrayal, revenge, and ultimate justice unfolds, stay with me until the very end. And please comment below with your city name so I can see how far this incredible true story travels across the world. My name is Myrtle Henderson, and I'm about to tell you the most devastating and ultimately triumphant story of my 68 years on this earth. It's a story about love, loss, family betrayal, and the kind of justice that only comes when you refuse to be a victim. But most importantly, it's about how my late husband Noel's love protected me even from beyond the grave. Let me start at the beginning because you need to understand just how deep this betrayal cut and how perfectly orchestrated my husband's protection turned out to be. Noel and I met 32 years ago at a church fundraiser in our small coastal town of Mendocino, California. I was 36, recently divorced, working as a bookkeeper for the local marina. He was 41, a widower with a 12-year-old son named Wade, trying to build his construction business from the ground up. What started as a conversation about the weather turned into coffee dates, then dinner dates, then long walks along the bluffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean. "You know what I love about you, Myrtle," Noel told me 6 months after we started dating, as we sat on a driftwood log watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. "You see possibilities where others see problems. You see hope where others see obstacles." I remember laughing, brushing sand off my shoes. "Is that your way of saying I'm an optimist? That's my way of saying you're exactly what Wade and I need in our lives." Wade. Even then, I should have paid more attention to the warning signs. The boy was polite enough when his father was around, but I caught the way he looked at me when Noel wasn't watching, like I was an intruder, a threat to whatever future he'd imagined for himself. But I was so in love with Noel, so grateful to have found my person, after thinking it might never happen, that I convinced myself time would heal those wounds. When Noel and I married 8 months later in a small ceremony at the Mendocino Presbyterian Church, Wade stood as his father's best man. He smiled for the photos, hugged me when prompted, and called me Mom exactly once during the reception when other people were listening. The moment we were alone, I went back to being Myrtle, or more often than not, nothing at all. "He'll come around," Noel assured me that night as we settled into our new life together in the house he'd built with his own hands. "He just needs time to adjust." Losing his mother was hard on him. I wanted to believe that. God, how I wanted to believe that. So I threw myself into being the best stepmother I could be. I packed Wade's lunches, attended his football games, helped him with homework, and celebrated every milestone. When he graduated high school, I was there cheering. When he went to community college to study business, I helped him with his applications. When he dropped out after a year to work for his father's construction company, I supported his decision. "Family business," I told Noel. "There's something beautiful about that." Henderson Construction grew from a one-man operation to a thriving company employing 15 full-time workers. Noel had a gift for both craftsmanship and business, but I like to think my bookkeeping skills and organizational abilities helped too. Every evening we'd sit at the kitchen table going over invoices, planning projects, discussing the future. "We're building something real here, Myrtle," Noel would say, his weathered hands covering mine, "something that will last long after we're gone." Wade worked his way up through every position in the company: laborer, carpenter, project supervisor. By the time he was 30, he was essentially running day-to-day operations while Noel focused on client relationships and long-term planning. I watched him grow into a capable, if increasingly entitled man who seemed to believe his father's success was somehow his birthright. That's when Romy entered the picture. Romy Castellanos was everything Wade apparently wanted in a woman: young, beautiful, ambitious, and completely uninterested in anyone who couldn't advance her social or financial position. She worked as a real estate agent in the affluent town of Healdsburg, specializing in high-end properties for Bay Area executives looking for wine country retreats. When Wade met her at a client's housewarming party, she was 26 to his 32, with glossy black hair, designer clothes, and the kind of smile that made promises she had no intention of keeping. "She's intense," I told Noel after their first family dinner together. We were cleaning dishes while Wade and Rami sat on the deck, her laughter carrying through the open doors like wind chimes in a storm. "You don't like her," Noel observed, handing me a plate to dry. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Your mouth gets that little line above it when you're trying not to say something." I looked at my husband of 22 years, this man who could read me like a blueprint he'd drawn himself. "She looks at everything like she's calculating its worth, including Wade. Maybe that's what he needs, someone who challenges him." But as the months passed, it became clear that Rami wasn't challenging Wade. She was changing him. Or maybe she was just revealing who he'd been all along. The son who had been merely distant became actively dismissive. The young man who had at least pretended to respect me started making pointed comments about blood family and what really matters. "Rami thinks we should renovate the kitchen," Wade announced one Sunday dinner about 6 months into their relationship. "Update it to match the rest of the house's potential." I looked around the kitchen I'd lovingly maintained for over 2 decades, with its farmhouse sink, hand-painted tiles, and the breakfast nook where Noel and I had shared thousands of morning conversations over coffee and newspapers. "I like our kitchen just fine," I said carefully. Rami's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against her wine glass. "Of course you do, but Wade and I are thinking about the future, about what this place could become." The way she said "could become" made it clear she wasn't talking about improvements to our home. She was talking about taking it over. They married 2 years later in an elaborate ceremony that cost more than some people's houses. Noel and I contributed significantly to the wedding expenses, as did Romi's parents, but somehow Wade managed to make it seem like his generosity alone had made their dream wedding possible. "Thank you for welcoming me into the Henderson family," Romy said during her reception speech, looking directly at Noel while somehow managing to look through me entirely. "I promise to honor the Henderson name and everything it represents." After the wedding, the subtle campaign to push me out of my own family began in earnest. Wade and Rami would make plans that somehow never included me. They'd have whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Romy would rearrange things in my house when she visited, then act surprised when I mentioned it. "I was just trying to help," she'd say with wide, innocent eyes. "I thought you'd appreciate someone with a fresh perspective." The worst part was watching how Noel seemed oblivious to it all. Or maybe he saw it and chose to believe it would resolve itself the way he'd believed Wade would eventually warm up to me all those years ago. "She's just trying to find her place in the family," he'd say when I brought up Romy's latest boundary-crossing behavior. "Give her time." But I was starting to realize that Romy wasn't trying to find her place in our family. She was trying to eliminate my place in it. The attacks became more direct as the years passed. Romy would suggest that I seemed tired at family gatherings, implying I was too old to keep up. She'd make comments about how set in their ways older people became, how resistant to change. She'd talk about the burden of caring for aging parents, looking meaningfully at Wade while I sat right there. When I turned 65, Romy threw me a surprise birthday party that felt more like a retirement send-off. Everything about it suggested I was moving into my twilight years. The decorations, the music, even the cake design. She gave a speech about how wonderful it must be to finally be able to relax and let the younger generation take care of things. I saw what she was doing, but Noel just saw his daughter-in-law throwing his wife a lovely party. 2 years ago, Wade approached his father about officially transferring ownership of Henderson Construction to him. "I've been running the day-to-day operations for years," He argued over a family dinner that felt more like a business negotiation. It makes sense to make it official, for tax purposes, if nothing else. We'll think about it, Noel said, but I could see he was already considering it. He loved his son, wanted to see him succeed, wanted to believe that Wade had earned the right to inherit what they'd built together. That night, as we got ready for bed, I voiced my concerns. Something doesn't feel right about this, Noel. The way Wade brought it up, the timing, and Rami's been pushing for this for months. Noel sat on the edge of our bed, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. Maybe it is time, Myrtle. I'm not getting any younger, and Wade has proven himself capable. It's not about capability. It's about respect, about family. Wade looks at me like I'm a placeholder in his father's life, and Rami looks at me like I'm an obstacle to overcome. What happens to me if something happens to you? My husband took my hands in his, and I felt the calluses from 45 years of construction work the strength that had built our life together board by board. Nothing's going to happen to me, he said. And even if it did, you'd be protected. I'd make sure of that. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. But late at night, when the ocean fog rolled in and the house creaked around us, I'd lie awake wondering what protection could possibly withstand the kind of systematic campaign Wade and Rami had been waging against me. As it turned out, Noel had been making preparations I never could have imagined, but I wouldn't discover that until it was almost too late. The end began on a Tuesday morning in March. I woke up to find Noel sitting on the edge of our bed, clutching his chest and struggling to breathe. "Myrtle," he whispered, his face gray with pain. "Call 911. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, but I could see in their eyes that 8 minutes might as well have been 8 hours. They worked on him in our bedroom, then in the ambulance, then in the emergency room at Mendocino Coast District Hospital. Wade and Romy arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after I called them. Romy still perfectly made up despite the early hour, Dr. Todd. Martinez found us in the waiting room at 11:47 a.m. "I'm so sorry," she said, and those 3 words collapsed my entire world. We did everything we could, but the damage to his heart was too extensive. He passed peacefully. I remember the sound I made. Not quite a scream, not quite a sob, but something primal that came from the deepest part of my soul. Wade stepped forward and put his arms around me, and for just a moment, I thought maybe grief would bring us together the way joy never had. But when I looked up at him through my tears, I saw something in his eyes that chilled me to the bone. Not grief, not sorrow, relief. The next week passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, casseroles from neighbors, and the kind of administrative tasks that death demands of the living. Wade took charge of everything with an efficiency that might have seemed caring if I hadn't known him better. He handled the funeral home, the church service, the burial arrangements, the obituary, all while somehow managing to make me feel like a guest at my own husband's funeral. Rami played the grieving daughter-in-law perfectly, accepting condolences with just the right amount of composed sorrow, making all the appropriate comments about what a wonderful man Noel had been and how much he'd be missed. But I caught her checking her phone during the service, saw her scanning the crowd like she was networking at a business event. The funeral was beautiful. Our little Presbyterian church was packed with everyone whose lives Noel had touched, clients whose homes he'd built, workers whose families he'd supported, neighbors who'd known him as a man of integrity and kindness. The pastor spoke about love lasting beyond death, about the foundations we build that outlive our physical presence. I sat in the front pew wearing the black dress I'd bought for Noel's mother's funeral 15 years earlier, holding on to the wedding ring I'd worn for 30 years, trying to process the reality that I would never again hear his key in the front door, never again feel his arms around me in the dark, never again share morning coffee and comfortable silence. After the burial, people came back to our house, my house, I had to remind myself, for the traditional gathering of food and memories that helps the living process loss. I moved through the crowd like a sleepwalker, accepting hugs and condolences, listening to stories about my husband that reminded me just how much he'd meant to so many people. That's when I overheard the conversation that changed everything. I was coming out of the kitchen with a fresh pot of coffee when I heard Wade's voice from the living room speaking in the low, urgent tone people use when they think they're being private. "We need to handle this quickly and cleanly," he was saying to someone. "The longer we wait, the more complicated it gets." I stopped in the hallway hidden by the open kitchen door. "Are you sure about the legalities?" That was Romi's voice, carefully modulated. "I mean, what if she fights it?" "She won't fight it. Where would she go? What would she do? She's 68 years old with no real assets of her own. She'll take whatever settlement we offer and be grateful for it." My hands started shaking so hard I had to set the coffee pot down on the hall table. "And you're certain about the house," Romy continued. "About the business. Dad never officially transferred anything to her. Her name might be on some accounts, but the important stuff, the business, this property, the real assets, those are still in Dad's name, which means they go to me as his heir." "What about the will?" Wade's laugh was cold and calculating. "Dad's will is from 15 years ago, before he really built up the business. It divides everything equally between me and Myrtle, but the way it's written, I get control of the business operations, and she gets whatever's left after debts and expenses are settled." I pressed myself against the wall, trying to process what I was hearing. "How much do you think that'll be?" Romy asked. "Maybe 50, 60,000. Enough for her to rent a little apartment somewhere and live quietly. The important thing is getting her out of this house so we can properly renovate it. This place has incredible potential once we remove all her personal touches." They were talking about my life, my home, my future, like I was already dead, like I was just another obstacle to be efficiently removed. "When do we tell her?" Romy's voice carried that barely contained excitement she got when she was about to acquire something she wanted. "Soon. No point in drawing this out. The faster we transition everything, the better for everyone involved." That night, after the last guest had left and the house was finally quiet, I sat at the kitchen table where Noelle and I had shared so many meals, so many conversations, so many dreams. The silence was deafening. For the first time in 30 years, I was completely, utterly alone. I thought about what I'd overheard, trying to make sense of it. Wade seemed so confident about his legal position, so certain that I had no claim on the life Noelle and I had built together. Could that be true? Had my husband of 30 years really left me with nothing? I pulled out the folder where we kept our important documents, insurance policies, the deed to the house bank statements, tax returns. Most of it was beyond my understanding, but as I looked through everything, one thing became clear. Almost everything was still in Noel's name alone, just as Wade had said. The house deed listed Noel as the primary owner with me as a joint tenant, whatever that meant legally. The business incorporation papers showed Henderson Construction as owned solely by Noel Henderson. Even most of our bank accounts were in his name, with me listed as an authorized user. Had I been living in a fool's paradise all these years? Had I been so focused on being a loving wife that I'd failed to protect my own future? I was still sitting there at 2 a.m. when I heard a car pull into our driveway. Through the kitchen window, I saw Wade's truck. He had a key, of course. He'd grown up in this house, but something about him using it now, so soon after his father's death, felt like a violation. He came through the front door quietly, probably thinking I was asleep. I heard him moving around the living room, and then his footsteps headed toward Noel's home office. I crept to the doorway and saw him systematically going through his father's desk, removing files and papers. In the dim light from the desk lamp, his face looked focused and determined. This wasn't the face of a grieving son gathering mementos. This was the face of a man taking inventory of his inheritance. "Wade," I called softly from the doorway. He spun around, startled, clutching a stack of papers to his chest. "Myrtle, I didn't know you were awake." "What are you doing?" "Just collecting some business documents, things that can't wait until morning." At 2 in the morning. His jaw tightened in that way it always did when he felt challenged. "These are Henderson construction documents, Myrtle. They belong to the business, which means they belong to me now." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. "Your father isn't even cold in the ground, Wade." "My father is dead," he said, and his voice carried not grief, but impatience, as if my emotions were an inconvenience to be managed. "And life goes on, responsibilities go on, the business goes on." He walked past me toward the front door, still clutching the papers. "We need to talk tomorrow, Myrtle. There are decisions that need to be made." After he left, I went back to the kitchen table and sat there until dawn, watching the sunrise paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and pink through our big front window. The same view I'd shared with Noelle for 30 years, the same beauty that had started each day of our married life together. And I realized that Wade and Rami were counting on my grief to make me compliant. They expected me to be so overwhelmed by loss that I'd gratefully accept whatever scraps they threw my way. They thought I was just a little old lady who'd be relieved to have someone else make the hard decisions. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. The confrontation came exactly 1 week after the funeral on a Tuesday evening that started like any other. I was in the kitchen making dinner, just for one now adjustment I was still learning to navigate, when Wade and Rami arrived without calling first. "We need to talk," Wade announced, settling himself at the head of the kitchen table like he owned the place, which apparently he believed he did. Rami sat beside him, her expression a careful mask of sympathetic concern. She was wearing a black blazer over dark jeans, funeral colors adapted for business, I realized. "Of course," I said, though something in my chest was already tightening. "Let me just turn off the stove." I moved the pot of soup away from the heat and took my seat across from them, the same seat I'd occupied for thousands of family dinners over the decades. But tonight somehow I felt like a stranger in my own home. Wade cleared his throat and pulled out a folder. "Myrtle, we know this is a difficult time and we want to make this as easy as possible for you." "Make what as easy as possible?" "The transition," Romy said smoothly. "This house is too big for you now, too much for one person to maintain. The bills alone must be overwhelming." I stared at her, trying to process the audacity. "I've been managing our household expenses for 30 years, Romy." "Of course you have," Wade interjected, "but things are different now. Dad's gone and the financial reality is complicated." He opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "Here's the situation, Myrtle. Dad's will divides his estate between us, but the debts against the business are significant. More significant than you probably realize." "What kind of debts?" "Equipment loans, contractor bonds, tax obligations. Henderson Construction owes nearly $200,000 in various obligations that have to be settled before any estate assets can be distributed." My mouth went dry. 200,000. "We've been working with the company accountant and the numbers are pretty clear. After settling business debts and covering funeral expenses and estate taxes, there might be 60 to 70,000 left to split." Rami leaned forward, her voice honey-sweet with false compassion. "We know that sounds scary, but we have a solution that works for everyone." She slid a document across the table toward me. "We're prepared to buy out your half of the estate for $40,000 cash. You can use that money to get a nice little apartment somewhere, maybe closer to town where you won't need to drive as much." I looked down at the papers. Some kind of legal agreement full of whereases and heretofores that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. But the intent was clear enough. "You want me to sign away my claim to everything Noel and I built together for $40,000. We want to help you transition to a more manageable living situation," Wade said. "This house has always been too much for someone your age. Dad knew that. He was just too polite to say anything." The casual cruelty of that lie hit me like a physical blow. Noel had loved this house, loved the life we'd created here. He'd talked just months ago about growing old together on this bluff overlooking the ocean. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, and I hated how small my voice sounded. "There are some lovely senior communities in Ukiah," Romy said brightly, "much more appropriate for someone in your stage of life. You'd have people around you, activities, maybe even some friends your own age." Friends my own age. As if my 30 years of life in this community, the relationships I'd built, the roots I'd put down were somehow invalid because I'd reached a certain number of birthdays. "And what happens to this house?" Wade and Rami exchanged a quick look. "We'll take care of it," Wade said. "Keep it in the family. Maybe rent it out. Maybe renovate it. The important thing is making sure it doesn't become a burden for you." I looked around the kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals, where I'd nursed Noel through his bout with pneumonia 5 years ago, where we'd celebrated anniversaries and birthdays and quiet Sunday mornings. Every tile, every cabinet pull, every inch of this space held memories that were apparently worth $40,000. "I need time to think about this," I said finally. Wade's face tightened with impatience. "Myrtle, we're trying to help you here. The longer we drag this out, the more complicated it gets. Estate lawyers, probate, court tax implications. You don't want to deal with all that." "Maybe I do." The words came out stronger than I'd intended, and I saw something flicker in both their faces. Surprise, maybe, or annoyance that their careful script wasn't proceeding as planned. Rami's smile became more forced. "Of course you need time to process this. It's a big change, but Wade's right about the timeline. These things are much simpler when families can work together privately." 2 weeks, Wade said, closing the folder. "We need an answer in 2 weeks so we can start settling Dad's affairs properly." They left me sitting at that kitchen table with the legal documents spread in front of me like tarot cards predicting a very dark future. $40,000 for a lifetime of love work and partnership. $40,000 for the home where I'd expected to live out my remaining years, surrounded by memories of the man who'd made me feel truly cherished for the first time in my life. I called our family lawyer the next morning, a kind man named Robert Chen, who'd handled our wills and various legal needs over the years. His secretary said he was booked solid for 2 weeks, but could squeeze me in for a brief consultation the following Monday. "Is this regarding Noel's estate?" she asked. "Yes." "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Henderson. Mr. Chen mentioned what a good man your husband was." That night I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house room by room, touching things that suddenly felt precious and fragile. The built-in bookshelf Noel had crafted for the living room, the bathroom vanity he'd designed specifically to accommodate my height, the deck he'd extended so we could watch the sunset together every evening. Every improvement, every modification, every loving detail had been created with both of us in mind. This wasn't just Noel's house that I happened to live in. It was our home built and shaped by our partnership. But somehow, legally, none of that seemed to matter. I was still awake at 3 a.m. when the phone rang. Who calls at 3 in the morning except hospitals and emergencies? My heart racing, I grabbed the extension in the bedroom. "Mrs. Henderson." The voice was unfamiliar professional. "Yes." "This is James Morrison from Morrison and Associates Financial Planning. I apologize for calling so late, but I just returned from a business trip and saw the obituary for your husband. I wanted to reach out well before certain processes move forward." "I'm sorry. Who are you?" "I worked with your husband on some financial planning matters, confidential matters that he wanted to remain private until after his death. Mrs. Henderson, we need to meet. Soon. There are some things about your situation that you don't understand." My hands started shaking again. "What kind of thing?" "The kind that are best discussed in person. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning, say 10 o'clock? I looked at the clock. In 7 hours, I might learn something that would change everything, or I might discover that my situation was even worse than Wade and Rami had suggested." "I'll be there," I said. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed Noel and I had shared for 3 decades, looking out at the dark ocean beyond our windows. Somewhere out there in the black water, answers were waiting. And for the first time since my husband's death, I felt a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. Whatever James Morrison had to tell me, it couldn't be worse than losing everything I'd ever loved. Could it? I barely slept that night, my mind racing with questions about what James Morrison might reveal. By dawn, I'd replayed every conversation with Noel about our finances, searching for clues I might have missed. Had my husband been hiding something from me? And if so, was it something that would save me or destroy me completely? I arrived at Morrison and Associates Financial Planning 15 minutes early, my hands still trembling from too much coffee and too little sleep. The office was located in a converted Victorian house in downtown Mendocino with polished hardwood floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the village's main street. It was the kind of place that whispered of old money and careful planning. James Morrison was younger than I'd expected, maybe 55, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of quiet intensity that suggested he took his work very seriously. His handshake was firm, his office immaculate, and his eyes held a mixture of sympathy and something else I couldn't quite identify. "Mrs. Henderson, thank you for coming so quickly. Please have a seat." He gestured to a leather chair across from his desk. "Can I offer you coffee? Water?" "I'm fine, thank you." I wasn't fine, but politeness was ingrained in me after 68 years. "You said there were things about my situation that I don't understand." He nodded, pulling out a thick folder. "Before we begin, I need you to understand that everything your husband and I discussed was held in the strictest confidence. He made me promise not to contact you until after his death, and only then if it became clear that you were unaware of certain arrangements he'd made." My heart started pounding. "What kind of arrangements?" "Mrs. Henderson, how much do you know about your husband's financial planning beyond your joint household accounts? I know we have savings, some investments. I handle the household budget, but Noel always took care of the bigger financial decisions." I paused, feeling suddenly foolish. I trusted him to handle those things, and he was protecting you by handling them. But he was also protecting you from Wade. The mention of my stepson's name sent a chill through me. "What do you mean?" Morrison opened the folder and pulled out the first document. "Mrs. Henderson, your husband came to me 5 years ago with some very specific concerns. He'd noticed changes in Wade's behavior, particularly after Wade married Romy. Noel was worried about what might happen to you if something happened to him. He never told me he was worried. He didn't want to worry you unnecessarily. But he was very clear about his primary concern, ensuring that you would be financially secure and protected regardless of Wade's intentions." Morrison slid a document across the desk. "This is a trust agreement that your husband established 3 years ago, the Myrtle Henderson Family Trust." I stared at the paper, seeing my name but struggling to understand the legal language. "What does this mean?" "It means, Mrs. Henderson, that your husband transferred significant assets into a trust with you as the primary beneficiary, assets that Wade knows nothing about." My hands went numb. "What kind of assets?" "Let's start with the house. While the original deed shows Noel as the primary owner, he executed a trust deed transfer 2 years ago. The property is now owned by your trust, which means it belongs to you completely and unambiguously." I felt like the room was spinning. "But Wade said he showed me documents." "Wade showed you the original deed, which is still on file with the county recorder's office. But the trust deed supersedes that. Your house cannot be taken from you, Mrs. Henderson. Your stepson has no legal claim to it whatsoever." Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I started crying. I hadn't even realized how terrified I'd been of losing my home until the threat was lifted. Morrison handed me a box of tissues. "There's more, Mrs. Henderson. Much more." He pulled out another set of documents. "Henderson Construction. Wade believes he's entitled to inherit the business, but the reality is quite different." "What do you mean, Tub?" 2 years ago, your husband restructured the business ownership. The company is now owned 60% by the Myrtle Henderson Family Trust, 30% by Noel Henderson personally, and 10% by Wade Henderson. I stared at him. "I own 60% of the business." "You do, which means you have controlling interest." Wade is entitled to his 10% share and he can inherit his father's 30%, giving him 40% total, but you control the company. My mind was reeling. Why would Noel do this without telling me? Because he knew Wade was already making plans. Your husband was a smart businessman, Mrs. Henderson. He saw the way Wade looked at the company, the assumptions he was making. Noel wanted to protect what you'd built together, but he also wanted to ensure that Wade couldn't simply push you aside. Morrison pulled out more documents. There are also the investment accounts. Your husband was quite methodical about building security for you. He showed me statements for accounts I'd never heard of. Investment portfolios, CDs, money market accounts, all totaling nearly $400,000. $400,000, I whispered, plus the house, which is worth approximately $600,000 in the current market, plus your controlling interest in Henderson Construction, which generates roughly $200,000 in annual profit. I couldn't speak. Just yesterday, I'd been facing the possibility of living on Social Security in some tiny apartment. Now I was learning that I was wealthy. Mrs. Henderson, there's one more thing. Something your husband insisted I explain to you personally. He pulled out a handwritten letter sealed in an envelope with my name written in Noel's familiar scrawl. He wrote this 6 months ago with instructions that I was to give it to you only after explaining your financial situation. With shaking hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded 2 pages of my husband's careful handwriting. My dearest Myrtle, it began, and I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. If you're reading this letter, then I'm gone, and Morrison has told you about the arrangements I made. I pray you're not angry with me for keeping secrets, but I needed to protect you in a way that wouldn't cause family conflict while I was alive to handle it. I've watched Wade change over the years, especially since he married Rami. I've seen the way they look at what we've built, the way they talk about the future, as if it belongs to them. I heard Rami telling a friend at last year's Christmas party that she couldn't wait to modernize our house once the older generation was out of the way. I saw Wade going through business files in my office when he thought no one was watching. I love my son, but I love you more. You've been my partner in every sense of the word, and I will not let anyone take away the security you deserve after 30 years of building our life together. The money, the house, the business control, these are not gifts, my darling. These are your rightful share of everything we created together. You earned every dollar through your love, your support, your partnership, and your sacrifice. Wade will be angry when he discovers the truth. Rami will be furious. They will try to make you feel guilty, try to convince you that you're being unfair or greedy. Don't listen to them, Myrtle. What you have is yours by right. But I also want you to be generous if they approach you with respect and honesty. Wade is still my son, and despite his flaws, I hope he can learn to treat you as family should. If he proves himself worthy, you have the power to share what we built. If he doesn't, you have the power to protect yourself. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and smarter than you give yourself credit for. Trust yourself. Trust Morrison, and don't let anyone intimidate you. I loved you from the moment I met you until the moment I took my last breath. That love continues even now in the form of security and peace of mind. All my love, always, Noel. By the time I finished reading, I was sobbing so hard I could barely breathe. This was my husband's final act of love, not just providing for me, but empowering me to stand up for myself. Morrison waited patiently while I composed myself. He was a remarkable man, Mrs. Henderson. In 30 years of financial planning, I've rarely seen someone think so carefully about protecting their spouse. Wade doesn't know about any of this. Nothing. Your husband was very careful to keep these arrangements completely separate from anything Wade might have access to through the business. I thought about the meeting just days ago, Wade and Rami's confident assumption that I was helpless, their insulting offer of $40,000 for my entire life. What should I do now? That depends on how you want to handle Wade and Rami. You have several options. You could continue to let them believe they're in control until you decide how to proceed. You could confront them immediately with the truth, Or you could wait and see exactly what they're planning before you reveal your position. I folded Noel's letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. What would you recommend? Morrison leaned back in his chair, considering. Personally, I'd wait. Let them show their true intentions completely before you play your hand. Your husband suspected they were planning something, but he didn't know exactly what. Now you have the chance to find out just how far they're willing to go. You mean let them think they're getting away with it? For now. You're in complete control here, Mrs. Henderson. You can reveal the truth whenever you choose. But once they know what you know, they'll change their strategy. Right now, they're being honest about their intentions because they don't think you can stop them. I understood what he was suggesting. Let Wade and Rami expose themselves completely. Let them reveal just how callous and greedy they were willing to be. Then, when they least expected it, show them exactly how wrong they'd been about everything. There's one more thing, Morrison said. Your husband set up a provision in the trust that allows you to modify Wade's inheritance based on how he treats you after Noel's death. If Wade proves himself to be respectful and caring, you can choose to be generous. If he proves himself to be otherwise, I can reduce his inheritance. You can eliminate it entirely if you choose. The 10% business ownership he has now is secure. That was established years ago. But his right to inherit his father's remaining 30% is contingent on what your husband called treating Myrtle with the respect and love she deserves. The power of it was intoxicating and terrifying. I held Wade's financial future in my hands, and he had no idea. I need time to process all of this, so I said. Of course, but Mrs. Henderson, there's one immediate practical matter we need to address. You mentioned that Wade has been going through your husband's papers, removing business documents. Yes. He has no legal right to do that. As majority owner of Henderson Construction, those documents belong to you. If he's taken anything from your home, you have every right to demand their return. I thought about Wade in Noel's office at 2 a.m. gathering papers like he was claiming his inheritance early. What if he refuses? Then we involve the authorities. Theft of business documents is a serious matter, especially when it involves a company worth several million dollars. Several million dollars. My company was worth several million dollars. I drove home in a daze, my mind spinning with the implications of everything Morrison had told me. I wasn't a helpless widow facing poverty. I wasn't dependent on Wade and Rami's charity. I was a businesswoman with assets and options and power. But I was also exhausted, overwhelmed, and still grieving the loss of the only man who'd ever made me feel truly valued. The money and security were wonderful, but they couldn't replace Noel's presence in my life, couldn't fill the silence in our house, couldn't warm the cold space in our bed where he used to sleep. That evening, as I sat on the deck watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson, I heard a car in the driveway. Through the front window, I saw Wade's truck followed by Romy's silver BMW. They were coming for my answer about their insulting buyout offer. 2 weeks early. I folded Noel's letter and put it in my pocket, feeling its presence like armor against what was coming. Then I went to the front door to face my stepson and his wife, secure in the knowledge that everything they thought they knew was wrong. Wade came through the door first, moving with the confident stride of a man who believed he held all the power. Romy followed, her smile as sharp as broken glass. Myrtle, Wade said, settling himself in Noel's favorite chair without invitation. We wanted to check in, see how you were processing everything we discussed. I'm still thinking, I said carefully. That's understandable, Rami said, her voice honey-sweet with false compassion. It's a lot to take in, but we brought some additional information that might help you make your decision. She pulled out a folder. We've been looking at apartments in Ukiah, and we found some really lovely places. Senior communities with all kinds of activities and services. She spread out brochures across my coffee table. Look at this one. They have a craft room, a library, even a little garden where you can grow vegetables. And it's only $1,200 a month, which would be very manageable with your settlement money. $1,200 a month for a one-bedroom apartment in a senior community after 30 years of marriage to the man who'd built Henderson Construction from nothing. Of course, Wade added, you'd want to invest most of your $40,000 rather than spend it all on rent. With careful budgeting, you could make it last quite a while. I looked at these two people who were planning my exile with such meticulous attention to detail, and I felt something cold and hard crystallizing in my chest. Have you been inside the house recently, Wade, going through your father's things? He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Just business documents that needed immediate attention, bills, contracts, that sort of thing. Did you find everything you were looking for? Most of it. There are still some files I need to locate, but that's not really your concern. Isn't it? Something in my tone must have registered with Rami because her smile became more strained. What Myrtle means is that of course she wants to help with the transition. Don't you, Myrtle? I looked at this woman who'd spent years trying to push me out of my own family, who was now sitting in my living room planning my future like I was a problem to be solved. Actually, I said slowly, I've been wondering about something. Wade, you mentioned that Henderson Construction has debts of $200,000. At least. Maybe more. That seems like a lot for a successful business. Wade's jaw tightened in that familiar way. Dad wasn't as careful with money as he should have been in his later years. Some of his decisions weren't optimal. The casual disrespect for his father's business acumen, the same acumen that had built Henderson Construction from a one-man operation into a multi-million-dollar company, made my hands clench into fists. What kind of decisions, equipment purchases that weren't necessary, contracts that weren't profitable, salary expenses that were too high? Wade's voice carried the authority of someone who believed he understood business better than the man who'd actually built the business. I've been trying to clean up the financial situation for months, without talking to me about it. Why would I talk to you about business matters, Myrtle? You've never been involved in the company operations. Never been involved. I'd only kept the books for the first 10 years. I'd only handled client relations and scheduling for another 5. I'd only been the person Noel discussed every major decision with for the entire 30 years of our marriage. I see, I said. Rami leaned forward, sensing an opportunity. That's exactly why this buyout makes so much sense, Myrtle. You don't want to get caught up in complicated business problems. Better to take a clean settlement and start fresh. Start fresh, I repeated. Exactly. New place, new life, new opportunities to meet people your own age. No more worrying about maintenance on this big house, no more dealing with business complications. You don't understand. I looked around my living room at the built-in bookshelves Noel had crafted, the stone fireplace where we'd spent countless winter evenings, the picture windows that framed the Pacific Ocean like a living painting. You've really thought this through, I said. We care about you, Wade said, and I wondered if he actually believed that lie or if he was just practiced at telling it. We want what's best for everyone. What's best for everyone, I repeated. And you think what's best for me is a one-bedroom apartment in Ukiah. We think what's best for you is security and peace of mind, Romy said smoothly. No more financial worries, no more responsibility for things that are beyond your experience, beyond my experience, like the household budget I'd managed for 30 years, like the business decisions I'd discussed with Noel over thousands of dinner conversations, like the life I'd built board by board and dollar by dollar with my husband. I appreciate your concern, I said, and I was proud of how level my voice sounded. But I think I need more time to consider my options. Wade's patience finally cracked. Myrtle, you don't have options. You have a choice: accept our generous offer or fight us in court and lose everything to legal fees. Those are your options. There it was, the threat beneath all the false compassion and concern. Accept their terms or they'd destroy me financially in a legal battle I couldn't afford to fight. Is that what you think would happen? I asked. I know that's what would happen. I've already consulted with lawyers Myrtle. Dad's will is clear and your position is weak. Very weak. Rami nodded sympathetically. That's why we're trying to avoid all that unpleasantness. This way, everyone gets something, and no one has to go through the stress of litigation. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 68 years in my bones. But I also felt something else, the strength that comes from knowing you're not as helpless as people assume. I need you both to leave now, I said quietly. Wade's face darkened. Myrtle, you're making a mistake. A big mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. Rami gathered up her apartment brochures with sharp, angry movements. We're trying to help you, Myrtle. We're trying to be family. But if you want to make this difficult, then what? She paused in the doorway, her mask finally slipping to reveal the cold calculation beneath. Then you'll find out just how difficult things can get for someone in your position. After they left, I sat in the gathering darkness of my living room, not bothering to turn on the lights. Through the windows, I could see the lights of fishing boats heading out for the night, catch their paths across the dark water looking like moving stars. I pulled Noel's letter from my pocket and read it again by moonlight. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and smarter than you give yourself credit for. Tomorrow I would start proving him right. But tonight I would grieve not just for my husband, but for the family relationships that had been revealed as lies, for the trust that had been shown to be manipulation, for the love that had been nothing more than a patient wait for inheritance. Wade and Rami thought they knew exactly who they were dealing with. They thought I was a grieving widow who would be grateful for any scraps they threw my way. They were about to learn how very wrong they could be. The next morning I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt since before Noel's death. The fog of grief was still there, would probably always be there, but it no longer clouded my judgment. I knew exactly what I needed to do. My first call was to Morrison's office. When his secretary put me through, I could hear the concern in his voice. Mrs. Henderson, how are you feeling after yesterday's revelations? Determined, I said, and I need your help with something. Wade mentioned consulting with lawyers about my legal position. I want to know who he's been talking to. That's an interesting request. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that if Wade is so confident about his legal position, he must have gotten some very specific advice. And if his lawyer gave him bad information based on incomplete facts, that lawyer is going to be very embarrassed when the truth comes out. Morrison was quiet for a moment. You're planning something. I'm planning to let Wade and Rami show me exactly who they are before I show them exactly who I am. That could be risky, Mrs. Henderson. If they're planning something more aggressive, then I need to know about it before they act, don't I? He sighed, but I could hear admiration in his voice. Your husband said you were tougher than people gave you credit for. All right, let me make some calls. I'll see what I can find out about Wade's legal consultation. My second call was to Henderson Construction's office. Margaret Paulson had been the company secretary for 12 years, and I'd always liked her straightforward manner and fierce loyalty to Noel. Oh, Myrtle, she said, and I could hear her fighting tears. I'm so sorry about Mr. Henderson. He was such a good man. Thank you, Margaret. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Has Wade been making changes at the company since his father died? There was a long pause. Mrs. Henderson, I'm not sure I should. Margaret, I'm asking as Noel's widow and as someone who cares about the company's future. Please. He's been restructuring things, making personnel changes, canceling contracts, meeting with new suppliers. He says he's modernizing operations, but she lowered her voice. Mrs. Henderson, he fired Tommy Rodriguez yesterday. Tommy Rodriguez had been with Henderson Construction for 8 years, one of Noel's most skilled carpenters, and a man with 4 children to support. On what grounds? Wade said his work quality had declined, but that's not true. Tommy's work is as good as ever. I think I think Wade wanted to bring in his own people. What kind of people? Cheaper labor, less experienced but willing to work for lower wages. And Mrs. Henderson, there's something else. Wade's been going through all of Mr. Henderson's client files, especially the high-value projects. He's been making calls, telling clients that there will be leadership changes in the company. My blood ran cold. Wade wasn't just planning to inherit the business. He was already taking it over, making changes that would damage everything Noel had built. Margaret, I need you to do something for me, but it has to stay completely confidential. Can you make copies of any documents that Wade has removed from the office? Any files, contracts, financial records? I I could do that. But Mrs. Henderson, if Wade found out, he won't find out from me. But Margaret, I think there are things happening that Wade doesn't have the legal authority to do, and I may need evidence of his actions. I'll do it, she said quietly. Mr. Henderson always treated me with respect, and I owe him that much. That afternoon, I drove to Henderson Construction's headquarters for the first time since the funeral. It was a modest building on the outskirts of town, but Noel had been proud of it. He'd designed it himself with a showroom displaying examples of the company's craftsmanship and a workshop where the team could fabricate custom pieces. Wade's truck was in the parking lot along with two vehicles I didn't recognize. Through the office windows, I could see him in the conference room with three men in expensive suits. Margaret met me at the reception desk, glancing nervously toward the conference room. He's been in meetings like that all week, she whispered. New suppliers, he says, but they don't look like construction people to me. What do they look like? In real estate developers, the kind of people who buy up land and put up cheap housing as fast as possible. I felt a chill of understanding. Wade wasn't just planning to inherit Henderson Construction, he was planning to fundamentally change what the company did. Noel had built his reputation on quality craftsmanship, on taking time to do things right. These meetings suggested Wade had very different priorities. Mrs. Henderson, Margaret handed me a manila envelope. These are copies of everything I could gather quickly: financial records, client correspondence, personnel files. If you need more, this is perfect. And Margaret, if anyone asks, I was never here. I was walking back to my car when Wade emerged from the building, shaking hands with the three suits. He saw me just as I reached my car door, and his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, annoyance, and something that might have been fear. Myrtle, he called, jogging over to intercept me. What are you doing here? This was your father's company, I said evenly. I wanted to see how things were going. Things are going fine. Better than fine, actually. I'm implementing some improvements Dad had been considering. Improvements like firing Tommy Rodriguez. Wade's jaw tightened. Personnel decisions are part of running a business efficiently. Dad was sometimes too sentimental about employees. Sentimental. He was calling his father's loyalty to good workers sentimental. Who were those men you were meeting with? Potential partners, business opportunities that could take Henderson Construction to the next level. What kind of opportunities? Wade glanced back at the building where the three suits were getting into a black Mercedes. Large-scale development projects. Instead of building one custom home at a time, we could be building entire neighborhoods. The profit margins are much better. And the quality is relative, Myrtle. What matters is giving people affordable housing and building a sustainable business model. I thought about the homes Noel had built over the years, houses that were still standing strong after decades, crafted with the kind of attention to detail that made them family heirlooms. Wade was talking about replacing that legacy with cookie-cutter developments. Your father would have hated that approach, I said. Wade's face flushed with anger. My father's approach was outdated. He was stuck in the past, building houses like it was still 1950. The construction industry has evolved, and Henderson Construction needs to evolve with it or die. Is that what you're telling clients, that your father's way of doing business was wrong? I'm telling clients that Henderson Construction is entering a new era of efficiency and innovation. Most of them are excited about the possibilities. I doubted that was true, but I didn't argue. Instead, I got in my car and drove home, my mind working through the implications of what I'd learned. Wade wasn't just taking over the company. He was planning to destroy everything that had made it special, everything that Noelle had spent 40 years building. That evening, I spread Margaret's copied documents across my kitchen table and began to understand the full scope of Wade's plans. He'd already terminated 3 longtime employees, citing restructuring needs. He'd canceled 2 major projects that were scheduled to begin next month, telling clients that Henderson Construction was moving in a different direction. He'd signed preliminary agreements with the development company I'd seen him meeting with, committing to provide labor and materials for a massive housing tract that would use the cheapest possible construction methods. Most disturbing of all, he'd taken out a line of credit against the company's assets, borrowing nearly $100,000 to fund his expansion plans. $100,000 he had no legal right to borrow since he didn't actually control the company. I was still studying the documents when my phone rang. Morrison's voice was tight with concern. "Mrs. Henderson, I found out about Wade's legal consultation. He's been working with David Brennan." "Should I know that name?" "Brennan specializes in estate disputes. He's known for aggressive tactics and creative interpretations of inheritance law. The concerning thing is that Brennan has a reputation for encouraging clients to take preemptive action." "What kind of preemptive action?" "The kind that puts assets under the control of his clients before legal challenges can be mounted. Mrs. Henderson, if Wade is working with Brennan, he may be planning to move very quickly to consolidate his position." I thought about the line of credit, the personnel changes, the meetings with developers. "I think he already has." "What do you mean?" I told Morrison about my visit to Henderson Construction, about the documents Margaret had provided, about Wade's plans to transform the company. "My God," Morrison said when I finished. "Mrs. Henderson, he's acting like he already owns the business outright. If he continues down this path, he could destroy everything Noel built before I have a chance to stop him." "Exactly. And if he's borrowed money against company assets, that creates additional legal complications. Mrs. Henderson, I think it's time to consider revealing your position." "Not yet," I said, though my heart was racing. "I need to understand their full plan first. If I play my hand too early, they'll just adapt their strategy. This is very risky. If Wade continues making major business decisions, then I'll have even more evidence of his actions when the truth comes out." But as I hung up the phone, I wondered if I was being brave or foolish. Every day I waited was another day Wade could do irreversible damage to Henderson Construction. Every day was another day he could strengthen his legal position through fait accompli. The next morning brought my answer in the form of a knock at my front door. I opened it to find a young man in a rumpled suit holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Myrtle Henderson?" "Yes." "I'm serving you with legal papers on behalf of Wade Henderson and Henderson Construction." My hands shook as I took the envelope. Inside was a document that made my blood run cold, notice of eviction and demand for possession. Wade was trying to evict me from my own house. According to the legal papers, Henderson Construction held a lien against the property for unpaid consulting fees and business expenses, totaling $90,000. Since I was unable to pay this debt, the company was demanding possession of the house as settlement. It was brilliant and ruthless. Wade had created a debt that didn't exist, filed a lien against property he thought he would inherit, and was now using that fabricated debt to force me out of my home immediately. I called Morrison with shaking hands. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he said grimly. "Brennan's work, no doubt." "Mrs. Henderson, this is fraud pure and simple, but fighting it will take time, and they're counting on you not having the resources for a long legal battle." "How long do I have?" "According to this notice, 30 days to pay the debt or vacate the property." 30 days. Wade was giving me 30 days to disappear from his life forever. "Mr. Morrison, I think it's time to stop waiting." "Are you sure?" Once we reveal your position, there's no going back to observing their plans. Their plans just became trying to steal my house with fraudulent documents. I'd say the time for observation is over. All right then. How do you want to handle this? I looked out my kitchen window at the Pacific Ocean, at the view I'd shared with Noelle for 30 years, at the life someone else was trying to steal from me. I want to give them exactly what they've given me. No warning, no courtesy, no chance to prepare. I want them to learn the truth the same way they delivered this eviction notice, as a complete shock that changes everything. What did you have in mind? A meeting. Tomorrow morning, tell Wade we need to discuss the eviction notice and my response to it. Let him think I'm ready to capitulate. And then I'm going to show him and Rami exactly who they've been dealing with. That night, I called Margaret at home. Mrs. Henderson, I'm so sorry about the eviction notice. Everyone at the office is talking about it. We can't believe Wade would do something like that. Margaret, I need one more favor. Can you arrange for me to address the Henderson construction staff tomorrow morning? All of them in the main conference room. I suppose so, but Mrs. Henderson, Wade won't like it. Wade is going to have much bigger concerns than whether he likes my addressing the staff. What's going on, Mrs. Henderson? There are rumors. Tomorrow morning, Margaret. Everything will be clear tomorrow morning. I spent that evening going through photo albums remembering 30 years of life with Noelle, pictures of us at company Christmas parties celebrating successful project completions, working side by side at community fundraisers. In every photo, we looked like partners, equals a team that had built something meaningful together. Wade appeared in many of the later photos, but even as a child, there was something in his expression that suggested he was calculating his place in the family hierarchy rather than simply enjoying the moment. And in the most recent photos, the ones that included Rami, I could see the subtle way she positioned herself, always between Wade and me, always drawing attention away from anyone else. They had been planning this for years, I realized, not just waiting for Noelle to die, but actively working to position themselves as his natural inheritors while marginalizing me as an outsider who had never really belonged. Tomorrow they would learn just how wrong they'd been about everything. I woke before dawn and dressed carefully in the navy blue suit I'd worn to Henderson Construction's 10th anniversary celebration. I wanted to look like the businesswoman I was about to reveal myself to be, not the helpless widow they expected me to remain. At 9 a.m. sharp, I walked into Henderson Construction's conference room. Wade was there with Rami along with David Brennan, a sharp-faced man with cold eyes who radiated the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from believing you hold all the advantages. Morrison sat quietly in the corner, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The entire Henderson Construction staff was also there, 15 men and women who had worked with Noel for years, who had built their careers on the foundation of quality and integrity he had established. They looked confused and concerned, unsure why they'd been called to what appeared to be a personal family meeting. Wade looked annoyed by the crowd. Myrtle, I don't know why you asked the staff to be here, but this is a private family matter. Actually, I said, settling myself at the head of the conference table, the seat that had always been Noelle's. This concerns everyone in this room, because it's about the future of Henderson Construction. Brennan leaned forward. Mrs. Henderson, my client has been very generous in offering you alternatives to eviction. If you're here to negotiate, I'm here to clarify some misunderstandings about the ownership and control of this company. Wade's face was already flushing with impatience. Myrtle, we've been through this. Dad's will, your father's will, I interrupted, is not the only legal document that affects Henderson Construction's ownership. I nodded to Morrison, who stood and began distributing copies of documents to everyone in the room. These are the incorporation papers for Henderson Construction as they exist today, Morrison announced. As you can see, the company is owned 60% by the Myrtle Henderson Family Trust, 30% by Noel Henderson, and 10% by Wade Henderson. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched Wade's face go through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a rage so pure it seemed to radiate heat. "That's impossible," he said, his voice barely controlled. "It's not only possible, it's been the legal reality for 2 years," Morrison replied calmly. "Your father restructured the business ownership in 2023 to ensure Mrs. Henderson would have controlling interest in the company they built together." Brennan was studying his copy of the documents, his confident expression cracking. These these would need to be authenticated." "They're completely authentic," Morrison said, "filed with the state, properly notarized and legally binding. Wade Henderson owns 10% of this company. When he inherits his father's 30%, he'll own 40% total. Mrs. Henderson owns 60% and has controlling interest." I looked around the room at the faces of the Henderson construction employees. Relief, understanding, and something that might have been hope were replacing their earlier confusion. "This means," I continued, "that every major decision Wade has made over the past 2 weeks, the personnel changes, the contract cancellations, the agreements with development companies, the line of credit he took out against company assets, all of it was done without proper authorization from the majority owner." Wade finally found his voice. "This is fraud. Dad would never have done this without telling me. Your father did exactly what he thought was necessary to protect what he'd built and the woman he loved." Rami, who had been silent through the entire revelation, finally spoke. "Even if these documents are real, Wade still inherits 30% of the company. We still have significant ownership." "Actually," Morrison said with that slight smile again, "that depends." He distributed another set of documents. Mr. Henderson established what he called a respect provision in his will. Wade's right to inherit his father's 30% business ownership is contingent on treating Mrs. Henderson with appropriate care and consideration after her husband's death. I saw the exact moment when Wade understood what this meant. The color drained from his face as he realized that not only did he not control Henderson Construction, he might not even get to keep the inheritance he'd been counting on. "What does that mean exactly?" Brennan demanded. Morrison looked directly at me. "It means Mrs. Henderson has the sole discretion to determine whether Wade's behavior since his father's death demonstrates the respect and care that would justify his inheritance." I stood up, feeling the power of my position for the first time since Noel's death. "Let's review Wade's behavior, shall we?" He went through his father's papers without permission, removing business documents from my home. He made major personnel changes without consulting the majority owner. He canceled profitable contracts and committed the company to projects that go against everything Henderson Construction has always stood for. He took out a line of credit he had no authority to secure. And yesterday, he served me with fraudulent eviction papers trying to steal my house with fabricated debts. I looked directly at Wade, who was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. "Does that sound like the behavior of someone who deserves to inherit 30% of a multi-million-dollar company?" Wade's face was now bright red with fury and panic. "You can't do this. I'm his son. I'm blood family. And I was his wife for 30 years. I was his partner in building this business from nothing. I was the woman he loved enough to protect even after his death." I turned to address the Henderson Construction employees directly. "Tommy Rodriguez, you're rehired as of this moment with full back pay for the time you were wrongfully terminated. Anyone else who was let go over the past 2 weeks, the same applies to you." The relief on Tommy's face was worth everything I'd been through. "The contracts Wade canceled will be honored if our clients are still interested. The development deal he signed is void. Henderson Construction will continue to focus on quality craftsmanship, not quantity construction." I looked back at Wade and Rami, who were both staring at me in shock. "As for the fraudulent lien against my house, Mr. Brennan, you'll be withdrawing that immediately. And Wade, you'll be returning every document you removed from my home, along with a detailed accounting of every decision you made on behalf of a company you never actually controlled." Wade finally exploded. "This is insane. You can't just take over Dad's business. You don't know anything about running a construction company." I've been involved in every major decision this company has made for 20 years. I know our clients, our capabilities, our finances, and our values. What I don't know is how to destroy everything good about Henderson Construction in the pursuit of quick profits. I sat back down feeling calmer than I had since Noel's death. Here's what's going to happen. Wade, you still own 10% of this company, which entitles you to 10% of the profits. You can continue working here if you can demonstrate that you understand who's actually in charge. But the destructive changes you've made over the past 2 weeks will be reversed, and any future major decisions will be made by me as the majority owner. And if I refuse, then you can sell your 10% back to the company and find other employment. Your choice. Rami leaned over and whispered something urgent in Wade's ear. He shook his head violently, but she kept whispering, her face desperate. Finally, Brennan cleared his throat. Mrs. Henderson, perhaps there's room for negotiation here. Surely we can find an arrangement that works for everyone. The arrangement that works for everyone is the one Noel created before he died. Wade gets what he's earned through his own behavior, no more, no less. I stood up again, feeling the weight of command settling on my shoulders. This meeting is over. Wade, I'll expect those documents back by tomorrow morning. Mr. Brennan, you'll be withdrawing the fraudulent lien today. Everyone else, let's get back to building the kind of houses that make Henderson Construction special. As the employees filed out, several of them stopped to shake my hand or offer quiet words of support. Margaret hugged me, tears in her eyes. Mr. Henderson would be so proud, she whispered. Wade and Rami remained seated, staring at the documents that had just destroyed all their plans. Brennan was packing his briefcase with the sharp movements of a man who realized he'd badly underestimated his opposition. This isn't over, Wade said as I reached the door. I turned back to look at my stepson, this man I'd tried so hard to love, who had repaid 30 years of care with betrayal and cruelty. You're right, I said. It's not over, it's just beginning. And Wade, every decision you make from now on will determine whether you end up with 10% of a successful company or nothing at all. As I walked out of Henderson Construction's conference room, I felt Noel's presence beside me, approving and proud. I had used the weapons he'd given me not just to protect myself, but to protect everything we'd built together. But I also knew that Wade and Rami weren't the type to accept defeat gracefully. If anything, learning the truth about their powerlessness would make them more dangerous, not less. The real battle was just beginning. The war that followed wasn't fought with weapons or loud confrontations. It was fought with paperwork and whispered phone calls with lawyers and accountants, with the kind of calculated cruelty that people use when they're desperate and cornered. Wade and Rami had lost the first battle, but they weren't surrendering. They were regrouping. I discovered their new strategy 3 days after the Henderson Construction meeting, when my phone rang at 6 a.m. The caller ID showed the name of Dr. Patricia Summers, my longtime physician. Myrtle, I'm calling because I received a very disturbing phone call yesterday from someone claiming to be your stepson. My blood chilled. What kind of phone call? He was asking about your mental state, whether I'd noticed any signs of cognitive decline or confusion. He claimed he was concerned about your ability to make sound financial decisions. The audacity of it took my breath away. Wade was trying to have me declared mentally incompetent. Dr. Summers, I hope you told him that information is confidential. I told him exactly that, but Myrtle, he seemed to know a lot about your recent financial activities. He mentioned large sums of money, business decisions, legal documents. He made it sound like you were being taken advantage of by unscrupulous advisors. I'm being taken advantage of, all right, just not by my advisors. I want you to come in for a full evaluation as soon as possible. If someone is questioning your mental competency, you'll want medical documentation proving otherwise. That same morning, I received a call from my bank. Someone had attempted to access several of my accounts, claiming to have power of attorney documentation. The bank had refused the access because no such documentation was on file, but they wanted to alert me to the attempt. Then came the call from Henderson Construction's insurance company. Someone had notified them of management changes at the company and suggested that my involvement might affect their coverage. The insurance agent was calling to verify the information and ensure that proper procedures were being followed for any ownership transitions. Wade and Rami were conducting a systematic campaign to undermine my credibility and legal position. They were contacting everyone who had any professional relationship with me, planting seeds of doubt about my mental capacity, and suggesting that I was being manipulated by others. It was brilliant, ruthless, and completely predictable. I called Morrison immediately. "They're trying to build a case for incompetency," I told him, "medical concerns, financial irregularities, undue influence. If they can convince a court that I'm not mentally capable of managing my affairs, then they can petition for guardianship or conservatorship," Morrison finished grimly, "which would give them control over your assets even if they can't inherit them outright. Can they do that? It's possible, especially if they can find a sympathetic doctor willing to question your mental state. Mrs. Henderson, this is a dangerous game they're playing. We need to respond immediately and aggressively. What do you recommend? First, get that medical evaluation Dr. Summers mentioned. Make sure it's thorough and well documented. Second, we need to gather evidence of what Wade and Romy are doing. Third, I think it's time to consider whether Wade has forfeited his right to any inheritance at all." That afternoon, I drove to Dr. Summers's office for the most comprehensive physical and mental evaluation of my life. Blood tests, cognitive assessments, memory tests, psychological evaluations. By the time it was over, I felt like I'd been dissected and reassembled. "Myrtle Tots," Summers said as she reviewed the results. "You are in remarkable health for a woman of 68. Your cognitive function is excellent, your memory is sharp, and your decision-making capacity is completely intact. If someone tries to question your mental competency based on medical grounds, I will personally testify to your fitness. Put that in writing, please, in the strongest terms possible." "Already done. And Myrtle, I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, and I've seen what family greed can do to elderly patients. What your stepson is attempting is not just legally questionable, it's morally despicable." That evening I was in my kitchen making dinner when I heard the sound of breaking glass from the living room. I rushed in to find one of the large front windows shattered with a baseball-sized rock lying on my Persian rug, surrounded by glittering fragments. There was a note tied to the rock with fishing line, "Stop being stubborn. Accept what's fair before you lose everything." I called the sheriff's office and reported the vandalism, though I doubted they'd be able to prove who was responsible. As Deputy Martinez photographed the broken window and bagged the rock as evidence, I found myself looking at my home with new eyes. For the first time since Noel's death, I felt genuinely unsafe in the house we'd built together. "Mrs. Henderson," Deputy Martinez said as he finished his report, "do you have somewhere else you could stay for a few days, just until things calm down? This is my home. I'm not being driven out of it." But after he left, and I was alone with the broken glass and the implicit threat, I wondered if stubbornness was the same thing as courage. The next morning brought a phone call that answered that question. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Carol Bright from the Mendocino County Adult Protective Services." My hand started shaking. "Yes. I received a report of concern about your welfare. The caller indicated that you might be living in an unsafe situation and that there were questions about your ability to care for yourself independently." "Who made this report?" "I can't disclose that information, but I'd like to schedule a home visit to assess your situation." This was their endgame. Wade and Rami had reported me to Adult Protective Services, hoping that an official investigation would find me incompetent or unsafe. If APS determined that I couldn't live independently, they could recommend guardianship or assisted living placement. "Ms. Bright, I'd be happy to meet with you, but I want you to know that I believe this report was made by family members who are trying to gain control of my assets through false allegations." That's certainly possible, Mrs. Henderson. These situations can be complicated. Would this afternoon work for a visit? Carol Bright turned out to be a tired-looking woman in her 50s who'd clearly seen every variation of family dysfunction that exists. She spent 2 hours in my home, checking my refrigerator, my medications, my ability to manage daily tasks. She interviewed me extensively about my finances, my social support system, my physical and mental health. Mrs. Henderson, she said as she prepared to leave, I want you to know that nothing I've seen here suggests you're unable to live independently. Your home is well maintained, you're clearly managing your affairs competently, and your mental acuity is excellent. Then why do I feel like I'm being investigated as a criminal? Because someone wants you to feel that way. In my experience, when family members make reports like this, it's usually about money, not genuine concern for the person's welfare. She paused at my front door, looking back at the boarded up window where the rock had crashed through. Mrs. Henderson, I'd encourage you to document everything that's happening. If this situation escalates, you may need evidence of harassment or intimidation. That night, I sat at my kitchen table making lists. Every phone call Wade and Rami had made to my doctors, my bank, my insurance company. Every attempt to access my accounts or question my competency, every threat, implicit or explicit, they'd made about my future. The pattern was clear and calculated. They were trying to systematically destroy my credibility and independence through a campaign of whispered doubts and official complaints. If they couldn't inherit my assets directly, they would try to gain control of them by having me declared incompetent. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated not just my mental capacity, but my determination to fight back. The next morning, I called Morrison with a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I want to revoke Wade's inheritance completely, I said. The respect provision in Noel's will, I want to invoke it. Wade gets nothing beyond his original 10% of the business. Mrs. Henderson, are you certain this is an irrevocable decision? I'm certain. Wade has shown me exactly who he is. He's tried to steal my house with fraudulent documents. He's attempted to have me declared mentally incompetent. He's damaged property and made threats. He's systematically tried to destroy my reputation and independence. That's not the behavior of someone who deserves to inherit anything from the man he's betraying. The legal standard is whether he's treated you with appropriate respect and care, based on what you've described. He's treated me like an enemy to be eliminated. Document everything, Mr. Morrison. I want Wade to understand that his behavior has consequences. That afternoon, Wade received official notice that his inheritance from his father's estate had been revoked due to his failure to meet the respect provision requirements. He would retain his original 10% ownership of Henderson Construction, but the additional 30% he'd been expecting to inherit would remain with my trust. The phone call came within an hour of his receiving the notice. You can't do this. Wade's voice was so distorted with rage I could barely understand him. I'm his son. I'm blood family. You're also someone who's tried to steal my home, question my sanity, and terrorize me in the house your father built for us. Blood doesn't give you the right to be cruel, Wade. This is about that bitch Rami, isn't it? You've always hated her. This is about your choices, about the way you've treated me since your father died, about the man you've chosen to become. I'll fight this in court. I'll prove you're mentally incompetent. I'll show everyone that you're being manipulated by lawyers who want to steal Dad's money. You're welcome to try, but Wade, every action you take from this point forward will be used as evidence of why your father was right to protect me from you. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking with adrenaline and grief. I had just cut the last tie between Wade and me, had formally acknowledged that the family relationship I'd tried so hard to nurture for 30 years was irreparably broken. But I had also sent a message that I would not be intimidated, manipulated, or destroyed by people who thought my age and gender made me vulnerable. The retaliation came that night. I was awakened at 2 a.m. by the sound of my fire alarm. I stumbled out of bed to find my kitchen filled with smoke. the acrid smell of burning plastic and wood choking the air. Someone had stuffed burning rags through the broken window into my living room, and the flames were spreading to the curtains and furniture. I called 911 and then grabbed the garden hose from the back deck, soaking everything I could reach while the fire department's sirens grew louder in the distance. By the time the firefighters arrived, I had managed to contain the blaze, but the damage was extensive. My living room was destroyed, the kitchen was smoke damaged, and the smell of burned memories permeated everything. Chief Rodriguez found me sitting on my front steps in my nightgown and robe, watching his crew ventilate the smoke from my house. Mrs. Henderson, this wasn't an accident. Someone deliberately set this fire. Do you have any idea who might want to hurt you? I looked at this man who had known Noel for 20 years, who had built a deck for us just 5 years ago, and I told him the truth. My stepson and his wife are trying to force me out of this house. They've made threats, broken windows, filed false legal papers, and now this. Do you have evidence? Some. Enough to establish a pattern of harassment. Chief Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, studying the charred remains of my living room through the broken window. Mrs. Henderson, arson is a felony. If we can prove Wade Henderson did this, he'll go to prison. If you can prove it, we'll try, but in the meantime, you can't stay here. The smoke damage alone makes the house uninhabitable until it's professionally cleaned and repaired. I looked at the home where I'd expected to live out the rest of my life, now rendered unlivable by the hatred of people who should have been family. Where am I supposed to go? Do you have friends or family who could take you in temporarily, family? The word felt like a bitter joke. My only family had just tried to burn down my house. I have friends, I said, finally thinking of Margaret from Henderson Construction, of Dr. Summers, of neighbors who had known Noel and me for decades. I have people who actually care about me. Margaret insisted I stay with her family until my house could be repaired. Her spare bedroom was small and plain, nothing like the master suite I'd shared with Noel, but it was clean and safe and offered by someone who genuinely wanted to help. Mrs. Henderson, Margaret said as she showed me where to find towels and extra blankets, I want you to know that everyone at Henderson Construction is behind you. What Wade's doing, it's not right. Mr. Henderson would be heartbroken. Mr. Henderson saw this coming, I said quietly. That's why he protected me. Over the next few days, as insurance adjusters examined my fire-damaged house and investigators collected evidence from the arson scene, I received an outpouring of support that surprised me. Neighbors I barely knew stopped by Margaret's house to check on me. Former Henderson Construction clients called to express their outrage at Wade's behavior. Even people I'd met only occasionally at church or community events reached out to offer help. Mrs. Chen, who lived 3 houses down from me, brought a casserole and a piece of information that changed everything. Myrtle, dear, I wanted you to know that I saw someone in your yard the night of the fire. I was up with the baby looking out the window, and I saw a figure near your house around 1:30. My heart started racing. Could you identify who it was? It was too dark to see clearly, but I did notice something specific. The person was wearing a very distinctive jacket, red and black plaid like a hunting coat, and they drove away in a dark pickup truck. Wade owned a red and black hunting jacket. Wade drove a dark pickup truck. I called Deputy Martinez immediately with Mrs. Chen's information. When he interviewed her, she gave the same description and agreed to provide a written statement. Mrs. Henderson, Deputy Martinez said, after taking Min Chen's statement, this isn't enough for an arrest warrant yet, but it's a significant piece of evidence. If we can establish that Wade Henderson owns a jacket matching this description, he does. I've seen him wear it dozens of times. Then we're building a case. Mrs. Henderson, I want you to be very careful. Someone who's willing to commit arson is capable of escalating to more dangerous actions. That warning proved prophetic sooner than anyone expected. 2 days later, I was leaving the bank where I'd gone to update my account information when I noticed a dark pickup truck following me. It stayed 3 cars back, matching my turns, maintaining the same distance. When I pulled into Margaret's driveway, the truck continued past, but I caught a glimpse of the driver, Wade. I called Morrison immediately. Mrs. Henderson, this constitutes stalking. Combined with the arson investigation and the pattern of harassment, we have grounds for a restraining order. Will a piece of paper stop someone who's already tried to burn down my house? No, but it will make any further contact a criminal offense. And Mrs. Henderson, I think it's time to consider involving the FBI. The FBI. This has crossed state lines. The fraudulent lien involved federal banking regulations. The systematic campaign of harassment could constitute wire fraud if they used phones or internet for their intimidation efforts. And arson of a residence is a federal crime if it can be proven to be part of a larger criminal conspiracy. The idea of federal agents investigating my family's situation felt surreal, but then again, everything about the past month had been surreal. Do it, I said. I want Wade and Rami to understand that their actions have serious consequences. The restraining order was granted the next day, prohibiting Wade and Rami from coming within 500 feet of me, my home, my car, or Henderson Construction. Deputy Martinez served the papers personally, finding Wade at a bar in Fort Bragg where he'd apparently been drinking since mid-afternoon. According to Deputy Martinez, Wade's reaction to the restraining order was explosive. He started screaming about how you were destroying his family, how you'd stolen everything that belonged to him. He threw the papers on the ground and said you'd regret pushing him too far. Did anyone else hear him say that? The entire bar. Mrs. Henderson, this man is becoming increasingly unstable. I strongly recommend you consider staying somewhere other than your friend's house. Wade knows where you are, and a restraining order is just paper. That night, I made one of the hardest decisions of my life. I packed the few belongings I'd salvaged from my fire-damaged house and drove to San Francisco, where I checked into a hotel under an assumed name. I wasn't running away. I was removing myself from the immediate danger while the legal system dealt with Wade and Rami, but I was also giving up temporarily the life I'd built with Noelle, the town where we'd been happy, the community where we'd been respected, the daily routines that had given structure to our marriage. Wade's campaign of terror was accomplishing exactly what he'd intended, driving me away from everything I loved. From my anonymous hotel room, I called Morrison with instructions that felt both empowering and heartbreaking. I want to sell Henderson Construction, I told him. Mrs. Henderson, are you certain that company was your husband's legacy? Wade has made it impossible for me to be involved in the company without constant conflict and danger. But I won't let him destroy what Noelle built. Find a buyer who will maintain Henderson Construction standards and take care of the employees. Someone who understands quality craftsmanship and treats workers with respect. What about Wade's 10% ownership? He can sell his share to the new owner or keep it, his choice, but he'll have no management authority and no say in company operations. And the purchase price, market value, whatever Henderson Construction is actually worth as a going concern. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Henderson, at current market valuations, you're looking at selling your 60% for approximately $4.2 million. $4.2 million. Added to the other assets Noelle had left me, I would have enough money to live independently and comfortably for the rest of my life anywhere I chose. Do it, I said. Find the right buyer and make the deal. 3 weeks later, Henderson Construction was sold to a company called Coastal Craftsmen, owned by a family that had been building custom homes in Northern California for 3 generations. They agreed to maintain the Henderson Construction name, retain all current employees, and honor all existing contracts. Wade's 10% ownership was purchased as part of the sale, giving him a check for $420,000, more money than he'd ever seen in his life, and a fraction of what he might have inherited if he'd treated me with basic human decency. The sale was finalized on a rainy Thursday morning in Morrison's office. I signed the papers that transferred ownership of the company Noelle and I had built, watching 30 years of history reduced to legal documents and bank transfers. Any regrets, Mrs. Henderson? Morrison asked as I signed the final page. Only that it came to this, I said honestly. Noel would have wanted the business to stay in the family, but Wade made that impossible. That afternoon, I received a text message from Wade. You destroyed everything Dad built. I hope you're happy. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I saved what your father built from someone who would have destroyed it for profit. The company will continue, the employees will keep their jobs, and the Henderson name will be honored. You could have been part of that legacy. You chose otherwise. His response came immediately, this isn't over. But I knew with a certainty that felt like relief that it was over. Wade had lost everything he'd schemed to acquire. The house belonged to me. The business was gone sold to people who would protect Noel's legacy. Wade's inheritance had been reduced to what he'd actually earned through his behavior. And I had learned something about myself that I'd never known. I was strong enough to fight back, smart enough to win, and brave enough to rebuild my life on my own terms. Standing in my hotel room looking out at the San Francisco Bay, I began to plan what came next. The woman who had been terrified of losing her home just months ago was now free to choose where to live, how to spend her time, and what kind of life to create with the security Noel had provided. Wade thought he'd won by driving me away from Mendocino. He didn't realize he'd actually set me free. Freedom, I discovered, was both exhilarating and terrifying. For the first time in my adult life, I had no one to consider but myself, no schedule to maintain but my own, no future to plan beyond what I could imagine. The weight of that possibility was almost paralyzing. I spent my first week of true independence in that San Francisco hotel room, ordering room service and watching the fog roll across the bay while I tried to decide what came next. The money from Henderson Construction's sale had been deposited into my accounts, transforming me from a comfortable widow into a genuinely wealthy woman. But wealth, I was learning, was meaningless without purpose. On my 8th day in the city, I received an unexpected phone call from Margaret. Mrs. Henderson, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from Mr. Morrison. Of course not, Margaret. How are things at the company? Amazing, actually. The new owners are wonderful. They kept everyone on just like they promised, and they're already talking about expanding the custom home division. But that's not why I'm calling. She paused, and I could hear voices in the background. Mrs. Henderson, there's something you need to know about Wade and Rami. My stomach tightened. What now? They left town, disappeared completely about 3 days ago, but before they left, Wade came to the office one last time. He was different, broken almost. He asked me to give you a message. I braced myself for another threat, another promise that this wasn't over. He said to tell you that he finally understood what his father saw in you. He said he was sorry it took losing everything for him to realize how wrong he'd been. The words hit me like a physical blow. After everything Wade had put me through, after the cruelty and the threats and the attempt to destroy my life, he was apologizing. Did he say where they were going? Romy's parents live in Arizona. I think they went there to regroup, maybe. Mrs. Henderson, I know he hurt you terribly, but he seemed genuinely devastated by what he'd done, like he'd just woken up from a bad dream and realized the damage he'd caused. I hung up the phone and sat by the hotel window watching seagulls circle over the bay. Wade's apology, if that's what it was, felt both meaningful and hollow. Sorry didn't repair my fire-damaged house or restore the sense of safety I'd lost. Sorry didn't erase the months of terror and harassment. But maybe, just maybe, it meant that the poison Romy had brought into our family hadn't completely destroyed the boy I'd once tried to love as my own son. That afternoon, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. I called a real estate agent in Carmel, a picturesque coastal town about 3 hours south of Mendocino, and asked her to show me properties with ocean views. I'm looking for something manageable, I told her. Maybe 2 bedrooms, a nice kitchen space for a garden, and I want to be able to see the water. Are you looking to buy or rent, Mrs. Henderson? Buy. I'm planning to make a fresh start. 3 days later, I was standing in the living room of a charming cottage perched on a bluff overlooking Carmel Bay. The house was smaller than what I'd shared with Noel, but it was bright and well designed with French doors that opened onto a deck facing the Pacific. The kitchen had been recently renovated, the bedrooms were cozy but comfortable, and there was a perfect spot for a reading chair by the front window. The previous owners were artists, the realtor explained as we toured the property. They designed everything to maximize the natural light and the ocean views. Standing on that deck, listening to the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Noel's death peace. This place felt like a possibility, like a canvas where I could paint whatever life I chose to create. I bought the house that afternoon, paying cash from my Henderson construction proceeds. By the end of the week, I'd arranged for movers to collect my salvage belongings from storage and purchase new furniture to replace what the fire had destroyed. I was building a new life from scratch, and every choice was mine alone. The house in Mendocino required extensive repairs before it could be put on the market. The fire damage was worse than initially assessed, and the insurance company's payout would barely cover the restoration costs. I could have walked away from it, could have let the insurance company deal with the property, but something in me rebelled at the idea of letting Wade's actions destroy the home Noel had built for us. Instead, I hired coastal craftsmen to restore the house to its original beauty. Every fire-damaged board was replaced with matching materials. Every smoke-stained surface was cleaned and refinished. The kitchen was rebuilt exactly as it had been, with the same farmhouse sink and hand-painted tiles Noel and I had chosen together. Mrs. Henderson, the project foreman, called to tell me when the work was complete. "You should know that we found something while we were rebuilding the living room wall." "What kind of something?" "A time capsule, a metal box hidden inside the wall cavity. It looks like your husband put it there when he built the house." My hand started shaking. "Can you bring it to me?" "Already on the way, should arrive tomorrow." The box was small, about the size of a shoebox, made of stainless steel and sealed with wax to protect it from moisture. Inside, I found photographs of Noel and me throughout our marriage, a copy of our wedding vows handwritten in his careful script, and a letter addressed simply to "My beloved Myrtle." "My darling wife," it began, "if you're reading this, then something has happened to me and you've had to make some difficult decisions about our home. I hope this house brought you as much joy as it brought me, and I hope you'll find a way to keep the love we shared here alive wherever life takes you next. I'm hiding this letter in the wall because I want you to know that every board, every nail, every carefully chosen detail of this house was placed with love for you, not just the love of a husband for his wife, but the love of a man who finally understood what home really means. You gave me 30 years of happiness, Myrtle. You gave me a sense of family I never thought I'd have again after my first wife died. You gave me a reason to build something lasting and beautiful. Whatever happens to this house after I'm gone, it will always be a monument to our love. Be happy, my darling. Be free. Be the strong, brave, wonderful woman I fell in love with all those years ago. All my love forever and always, Noel," I cried, until I had no tears left, sitting in my new living room in Carmel, holding this final gift from the man who had continued to love and protect me even from beyond the grave. The house in Mendocino wasn't just a property to be sold. It was a love letter written in wood and stone, a testament to 30 years of partnership and devotion. But I also knew that I couldn't live there again. Too much had happened, too much pain had soaked into those walls along with the smoke damage. The house needed to belong to someone who could make new memories there, who could fill it with fresh laughter and love. I put it on the market the next week, pricing it to sell quickly to a family that would appreciate what Noel had built. The buyers turned out to be a young couple with 2 small children, both teachers at the local elementary school. They fell in love with the house the moment they walked through the front door, and I knew Noel would have approved. At the closing, as I signed the papers transferring ownership, I felt like I was completing a circle that had begun with Noel's death. The house would continue to shelter a family, to provide the kind of security and happiness that Noel had always intended. and I would carry the love that had built it with me wherever I went. My new life in Carmel began slowly, quietly. I spent my first few weeks there simply getting used to the rhythms of a different place. The sound of the waves was constant but soothing, a white noise that helped me sleep better than I had in months. The town was small and walkable, with art galleries and bookshops and cafes where I could sit with a cup of coffee and watch tourists browse through streets lined with fairy tale cottages. But after the intensity of the battle with Wade and Rami, the peace felt almost strange. I had fought so hard for my independence, and now that I had it, I wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. The answer came unexpectedly through a conversation with my neighbor. Elena Vasquez was a retired social worker who lived in the cottage next to mine. She was about my age, with silver-streaked hair and laugh lines that suggested she'd found reasons for joy even in difficult work. We met when she knocked on my door to introduce herself, bringing homemade tamales and a bottle of wine. "I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood," she said with a warm smile. "It's nice to have someone closer to my age around here. Most of our neighbors are either 20-something tech workers or retirees with more money than sense." We sat on my deck sharing the tamales and watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson, and I found myself telling her about my recent experiences. Not the financial details, but the emotional journey, the loss of my husband, the betrayal by family, the discovery that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. "You know," Elena said thoughtfully, "what you've been through, learning to advocate for yourself, discovering your own power, that's something a lot of women never experience, especially women our age." "What do you mean, tss?" "I spent 40 years as a social worker, and I saw the same pattern over and over. Women who'd been wives and mothers their whole lives, who suddenly found themselves alone and didn't know how to fight for themselves. They'd let family members take advantage of them, let lawyers intimidate them, let the system push them around because they'd never learned that they had the right to push back." She paused, swirling the wine in her glass. "But you figured it out. You learned to use the tools you had, legal, financial, emotional, to protect yourself and get justice. That's not a common story, Myrtle. That's actually a pretty extraordinary story." "It doesn't feel extraordinary. It feels like I did what I had to do to survive." "Exactly. And there are thousands of women who don't know how to do what you did, who don't even know they have the right to fight back." Elena's words planted a seed that grew over the following weeks. I started thinking about the other women in situations like mine, widows being pressured by family members to give up their homes, elderly women being manipulated by relatives who saw them as obstacles to inheritance, wives who had never learned to advocate for themselves because they'd always had husbands to handle business matters. I thought about how lost I'd felt in those first days after Noel's death, how convinced I'd been that Wade and Rami held all the power. What if there were resources that could help women in similar situations? What if there were ways to share the knowledge I'd gained through my ordeal? The idea crystallized one morning when I was reading the local newspaper over coffee. There was an article about a legal aid clinic that was closing due to funding cuts, leaving low-income residents without access to affordable legal advice. The article mentioned that many of the clinic's clients had been elderly women dealing with estate and family issues. I called the newspaper that afternoon and asked to speak to the reporter who'd written the article. "This is Jenny Walsh. Can I help you?" "Ms. Walsh, I read your article about the legal aid clinic closing. I'm wondering if you'd be interested in writing about a different approach to helping women with legal and financial advocacy issues." "What kind of approach?" "Educational workshops, support groups, resource networks, ways to help women understand their rights and learn to advocate for themselves." Jenny was quiet for a moment. "Are you talking about starting something like that?" "I'm talking about funding it, and based on some recent personal experience, I think I might know how to make it effective." We met for coffee the next morning, and I told Jenny an abbreviated version of my story, enough to explain why I was passionate about helping women in similar situations not enough to reveal the specific financial details of my battle with Wade and Rami. "This is an incredible story," Jenny said when I finished. "And you're right. There's definitely a need for this kind of resource. How are you thinking of structuring it?" "I want to start with workshops, basic legal literacy, understanding wills and trusts, knowing what questions to ask lawyers, recognizing the warning signs of financial abuse. Then maybe support groups for women who are dealing with family conflicts over money or property." "And you'd fund this yourself?" "Initially, yes. I'm in a position to do that, but I'd also want to build partnerships with local attorneys, financial advisors, therapists, professionals who could volunteer their time or provide services at reduced rates." Jenny leaned back in her chair, studying me with the expression of someone who'd found an unexpected story. "Would you be willing to go public with your own experience? I mean, really public. If this program is going to get the attention and support it needs, people will want to know why you're passionate about it." The thought of sharing my story publicly was terrifying. I'd spent months trying to keep my legal battles with Wade and Rami as private as possible, trying to avoid becoming the subject of local gossip. But I also realized that my story only had power if other women could learn from it. What would that look like? A feature article about your experience and your plans for the advocacy program, maybe a follow-up piece once the workshops get started. The story would focus on empowerment, how you discovered your own strength and now want to help other women discover theirs. I thought about Noel's letter about his belief that I was stronger and braver than I gave myself credit for. Maybe sharing my story publicly was the ultimate test of that strength. "All right," I said, "let's do it." The article ran on the front page of the Carmel Pinecone 2 weeks later under the headline, "From Betrayal to Empowerment, Local Widow Fights Back and Helps Others Do the Same." Jenny had written it beautifully, focusing on the universal themes: family betrayal, the vulnerability of elderly women, the importance of legal and financial literacy, without sensationalizing the personal details. The response was overwhelming. My phone rang constantly with calls from women who'd read the article and wanted to share their own stories of family manipulation, financial abuse, or legal intimidation. Many of them were dealing with situations remarkably similar to mine: stepchildren or in-laws who assumed they could pressure elderly women into giving up their rights. "Mrs. Henderson, I can't thank you enough for speaking out," one caller told me. "I've been dealing with my late husband's son for 2 years, and he's been telling me I have no legal rights to the house we lived in for 30 years. After reading your article, I called a lawyer and found out that's complete nonsense." Another woman called to tell me that her own stepchildren had been pressuring her to move into assisted living so they could sell her house, using many of the same tactics Wade and Rami had used on me. They kept telling me I was too old to live alone, that I couldn't handle the responsibility of maintaining a house. They made me feel incompetent and burdensome. But your story made me realize that I don't have to accept their version of what my life should look like. Within a month of the article's publication, I had enough interest to schedule the first workshop. We held it at the Carmel Community Center, and I'd expected maybe 10 or 12 women to attend. Instead, nearly 40 people showed up, including several men whose mothers or wives were dealing with similar issues. I'd prepared a basic presentation about legal rights, financial protections, and warning signs of elder abuse, but the real power of the evening came from the stories people shared. Woman after woman stood up to describe experiences that echoed my own: family members who'd assumed they could take advantage of grief and vulnerability, legal intimidations that had turned out to be empty threats, financial manipulations that had seemed insurmountable until someone explained the actual law. "This is what I needed when my husband died," said a woman named Patricia, who was about my age. "Someone to tell me that I didn't have to be grateful for whatever scraps my stepson was willing to throw me. Someone to explain that I had rights and options." An elderly man named Robert raised his hand. My mother is 85, and my sister has been pressuring her to sign over power of attorney so she can handle mom's affairs. Mom doesn't want to do it, but my sister keeps telling her it's legally required. After tonight, I know that's not true, and I can help Mom understand her options. By the end of the evening, we'd formed the foundation of what would become the Coastal Women's Advocacy Network. I committed to funding regular workshops, a resource library, and a referral network of attorneys and financial advisors who specialized in elder law and family financial disputes. But the most meaningful part of the evening came at the very end when a woman approached me as people were leaving. Mrs. Henderson, I'm Carol Bright from Mendocino County Adult Protective Services. I drove down here specifically to attend your workshop. I recognized the name. She was the social worker who'd investigated the false report Wade had made about my competency. I wanted you to know, she continued, that what you're doing here is exactly what we need more of. I spend so much time investigating reports of elder abuse, but most of the time the real abuse isn't physical. It's financial and emotional manipulation by family members who think they can take advantage of older women. Have you seen Wade since he left town? No, and honestly, I hope I don't. But Mrs. Henderson, I want you to know that your case has become a training example for our staff. We use it to illustrate how sophisticated financial abuse can be and how important it is for elderly people to understand their rights and resources. 6 months later, the Coastal Women's Advocacy Network had expanded to include monthly workshops, a telephone helpline, and partnerships with legal aid organizations throughout Central California. We'd help dozens of women understand their rights, connect with appropriate legal representation, and develop strategies for dealing with family financial manipulation. I'd also connected with a network of women who'd become genuine friends, people who understood the journey from vulnerability to empowerment because they'd taken it themselves. Elena had become my closest confidant, and together we developed a support group for widows, dealing with family conflicts that met weekly at my house. But the most unexpected development was the letter that arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in March, exactly 1 year after Noel's death. It was addressed in handwriting I recognized, though it was shakier than I remembered. Wade's handwriting. Dear Myrtle, it began, and I could feel my heart rate increase as I unfolded the pages. I don't know if you'll read this, and I wouldn't blame you if you threw it away without finishing it, but I need to try to tell you some things that I should have said a long time ago. I've been in therapy for the past 6 months trying to understand how I became the kind of person who would try to destroy someone who had only ever been kind to me. The therapist says I was grieving Dad's death in a destructive way, that I was so angry about losing him that I needed someone to punish. You were the easiest target because you'd always been patient with my resentment, but it was more than that. Rami had been poisoning me against you for years, telling me that you were manipulating Dad, that you were keeping me from my rightful place in his affections. She made me believe that you were my competition instead of my family. I was so desperate to feel like I mattered to someone that I let her convince me you were the enemy. I know now that everything I believed about Dad's finances was wrong. The lawyer I consulted gave me advice based on information that wasn't complete, and I was so eager to hear that I was entitled to everything that I didn't ask the right questions. When I found out the truth about the trust and the business ownership, I should have been impressed by how carefully Dad had planned to protect you. Instead, I was furious that my assumptions had been wrong. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Myrtle. I don't deserve it. I tried to steal your home, destroy your reputation, and drive you away from everything you loved. I know the fire wasn't an accident. I was drunk and angry and stupid, and I could have killed you. That knowledge haunts me every single day. But I want you to know that selling Henderson Construction to Coastal Craftsmen was the right decision. I've stayed in touch with Margaret, and she tells me the company is thriving under the new ownership. Dad's reputation and legacy are being honored, and the employees are being treated well. You protected what he built better than I ever could have. I also want you to know that leaving you with all of Dad's assets was the right decision, too. You earned every dollar through 30 years of partnership and love. You deserve to spend your remaining years in security and peace, surrounded by people who actually care about you. I heard about the women's advocacy program you started. Margaret sent me the newspaper article. Dad would be so proud of you for turning your experience into something that helps other people. You found a way to make meaning out of the pain I caused you, and that's more generous than I had any right to expect. Romy and I are divorced. She left me when the money ran out, and it became clear that my inheritance wasn't going to fund the lifestyle she'd imagined. I'm living with her parents in Phoenix, trying to rebuild my life from nothing, and I'm learning that starting over at 45 is harder than I expected. But maybe that's what I need, to build something myself instead of waiting to inherit what someone else created. I don't expect you to respond to this letter. I don't expect anything from you ever again. But I needed you to know that I finally understand what Dad saw in you and why he loved you enough to protect you even from his own son. You are a remarkable woman, Myrtle Henderson. I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to realize that. With regret and respect, Wade. I read the letter 3 times, sitting at my kitchen table with my morning coffee growing cold, watching the waves crash against the rocks below my house. Wade's apology felt genuine in a way that his earlier desperate attempts at reconciliation had not. This wasn't someone trying to manipulate his way back into my good graces. This was someone who had genuinely reckoned with the damage he'd caused and the person he'd become. But forgiveness, I realized, was more complicated than accepting an apology. Wade's actions had fundamentally changed me, had forced me to become stronger and more independent than I'd ever imagined possible. I'd built a new life from the ashes of his betrayal, and that life was richer and more purposeful than anything I could have imagined. I never responded to Wade's letter, not because I was unwilling to forgive him, but because forgiveness was something I was still learning to navigate. Some wounds heal completely, leaving only faint scars as reminders of past pain. Others heal enough to function, to move forward, but remain tender to the touch. Instead of writing back, I made a donation to a substance abuse treatment center in Phoenix with instructions that it be used to provide therapy services for people dealing with family trauma and addiction issues. It felt like a way to honor Wade's apparent efforts to change his life without reopening a relationship that had caused too much damage to fully repair. 2 years after Noel's death, I stood on my deck in Carmel, watching another Pacific sunset paint the sky in shades of fire and gold. The Coastal Women's Advocacy Network had helped more than 300 women understand their rights and find resources to protect themselves from family financial abuse. I'd published a book about my experience that had become a resource for elder care advocates nationwide. I'd built a life that was full of purpose, friendship, and the kind of peace that comes from knowing you've used your pain to help others avoid similar suffering. Noel's love had protected me in ways I'd never fully understood while he was alive. His financial planning had given me security, but more importantly, his belief in my strength had given me permission to discover capabilities I'd never known I possessed. The woman who had felt helpless and vulnerable in the weeks after his death had transformed into someone who could advocate not just for herself, but for others facing similar challenges. Elena joined me on the deck that evening, as she often did, bringing wine and the easy companionship of someone who understood both loss and renewal. "Any regrets?" she asked, settling into the chair beside mine. I considered the question seriously. Did I regret the pain of Wade's betrayal, the terror of those months when I'd felt under siege, the loss of the family relationships I'd tried so hard to nurture? "No," I said finally. "I regret that it had to happen the way it did. I regret that Wade and I couldn't find a way to be family to each other, but I don't regret the person I became because of it. And if you could go back and change things, if you could have had Wade's love and respect from the beginning." I watched a pelican dive into the waves below, emerging with its dinner secure in its beak. Nature was full of creatures that had to fight for what they needed to survive, that had to adapt and grow stronger when their environment became hostile. If I could go back and change things, I said slowly, I might never have learned who I really am. I might have spent the rest of my life accepting other people's definitions of what I deserved, what I was capable of, what my life should look like. Elena raised her wine glass in a toast. To becoming who we were always meant to be, to discovering we were always stronger than we knew. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared over the Pacific, I felt Noel's presence like a blessing on the evening breeze. He had loved me enough to protect me, but he had also trusted me enough to fight my own battles when the time came. That trust, more than any financial security he'd provided, was the greatest gift he could have given me. The woman who had been afraid of losing everything had learned that the most important things, strength, dignity, purpose, the ability to help others, couldn't be taken away by anyone. They could only be discovered, developed, and shared. And in sharing them, I'd found a way to honor both the love that had sustained me and the battles that had transformed me into someone worthy of that love. The war was over. I had won, and the victory was sweeter than anything I could have imagined in those dark days when winning had seemed impossible.